You're listening to an interview with Chicago Tribune columnist Heidi Stevens on Vote Her In, a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Hi, everyone. This is Kelly. You're listening to Vote Her In, which is a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive, coming to you today shortly before Joe Biden is set to announce his VP pick. So I'll turn it over to Rebecca now, who will introduce our guest. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Kelly, and good morning. And good morning to all of you who are listening. We're, as always, thrilled with our guest today, Heidi Stevens, columnist for the Chicago Tribune. Her column is called The Balancing Act. But it strikes me as I think about it that doesn't really do justice to what she writes about, why she's here, and why we invited her to be here today. She consistently writes about issues that are very political in a way that shares the story of real people's lives and experiences. And she has also, in that context, been very forthright about the importance of women's leadership, the importance of women in politics, and not incidentally has written about the fact that Joe Biden's about to pick a woman for VP, and in Heidi's view, should pick a woman of color. So we have a lot to talk about, but I want to say that to start with, we thought we might begin by the fact, I want to quote from a piece actually that Heidi wrote reviewing my book, Vote Her In, and thank you again for that, Heidi, in which she said, "Revolutions don't happen overnight, and every day presents a new chance to act, to share messages that resonate, and to model behavior that will mobilize other women." Clearly, we're at that kind of a moment, needing to mobilize, to be supportive of this woman VP nominee. And I thought that we could therefore sort of begin by your sharing with us, Heidi, why you believe that, why you think mobilization now is so important, and why you, in that context, focus on the issues that you do. So welcome and thanks.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, just to elaborate for a second on the name of the column and how it has sort of shifted a little bit in its focus and mission since I started. It did start originally 7 or 8 years ago as kind of a work-life balance column. I was at the time a mom with 2 young kids and focused a lot on that kind of stuff. And you know, I do tend to focus more now on race and gender and politics. And I would argue that they're all of a piece, right? Because affects parenting and affects children. And certainly we can't have those conversations without including blind spots and biases and discrimination as they relate to race and gender, if we're talking about creating a healthy, equitable place for our children to grow up in and for parents to parent in and all of it. So I think it's all related. But I do sometimes wonder about the name of the column. Like, does this still apply? But I think it still does. That's just an aside. I think in the moment, so the piece that I wrote about Joe Biden needing to pick a vice president who's a woman of color, I actually went ahead and said a Black woman. I think in this moment in history, when we are finally having a long overdue reckoning about race, we need someone in an executive position in that number 2 spot with the lens that you have when you grow up in this country and live in this country and walk around in this country in Black skin. I just think we do. I think that, you know, I harken back all the time to something that, of all people, Sheryl Sandberg said, but it was such a great anecdote when she talked about when she worked at Google and didn't realize how badly they needed pregnancy parking spots in their gigantic campus with their gigantic parking lot until she herself was pregnant and had to park, 8 gazillion miles away from the building and then walk through the heat and, her swollen ankles. And so I just think that that's such a good crystallizing example of how we can be aware and read and listen and still have blind spots until we ourselves have lived through certain experiences, right? And I think in this moment, if we're going to turn this reckoning and these conversations that we're finally having into some action and some lasting change, Joe Biden needs a Black woman next to him to guide us to that place of action and change.
It makes absolute sense. I think we've all learned, some of us on a rougher path than others, the kind of thing that you're saying.
Well, and there's such a long list of qualified candidates. I mean, I think the conversation often gets bogged down to like, well, why can't we just focus on who's qualified? Why do we have to focus on identity politics? And I would argue that you can focus on both, because he has a short list of highly qualified Black women to choose from. It's not an either or.
Yeah. So just a quick follow-up on this. There was a column in yesterday's New York Times about the fact that selecting a woman as a VP candidate is hardly a revolutionary act. And the rationale was that the primary duty, at least for most vice presidents, is following in the footsteps of the guy ahead of you and saying, yes, sir, and doing what he asks you to do, as opposed to exercising true executive power. I'm wondering what your thoughts were when you saw that article in the context we're now in.
It was a good article. She made excellent points. I think this time might be a little bit different, partly because of Joe Biden's age. Statistically higher chance of, frankly, not making it through his first 4 years alive. And certainly I hope he does, but that if we're just looking at life expectancy and statistics and taking the emotion out of it. And then, in terms of him running for a second term, also a statistically lower chance because of his age. So, political analysts who believe that this VP pick, has a higher than average chance of being actually, the president sometime in the next 48 years. So it probably, there's a chance this person won't just be the number two the whole time and just sort of deferring to the number one or fluffing up the number one. But, I think the writer made excellent points about how that position, is sort of, I took it as sort of, it could be like not a sneaky way, but a way in for, a leader in a way that this country hasn't quite admitted to being ready for in the number one spot. In that number two spot, you're sort of like, you've got the power, but not all of it. And a lot of your power is geared toward making the number one look good. And there's a high emphasis on serving and sacrifice and sort of, roles that we're comfortable with women playing in a way that we're not so comfortable with women, wielding their power for, executive actions we're comfortable with and wielding their power to serve others.
Right.
So good points. I hope I hope we could look back on that article and have it feel a little retrograde.
Okay.
In a couple months. That would make me feel good.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So Heidi, you write a lot. As you mentioned, you started the column about, being about raising kids and balancing those things. But you still write a lot about family issues and challenges for children and parents. Like all parents in this country right now, myself included, you're thinking about things like, how do we get kids back to school ever again? Right. How do we educate them safely? What are the kinds of messages that you're really trying to sort of get across when you're writing about kids and family and parents and coming together in community, schooling issues, things like that? What are the things you're really the kinds of stories that you're really trying to tell?
Well, I try to use this platform I have to give a voice to, the perspectives and the insights and the experiences that are harder to come by, right? Who we don't hear enough from, because I think that's how we can start to better understand our communities and our neighbors and the towns and cities and states we live in, if we get a better sense of what it's like to live in them for people who aren't us, right? And so I try to seek out, people who I feel we don't hear enough from, and then help them tell their stories and use this platform to highlight what they're doing or how they're living. And sometimes that's a grieving mother who lost her son to addiction, or, sometimes that's a young activist who's, planning a food drive, but doesn't look how you'd expect a young activist to look. Unexpected stories, I suppose, and undercovered voices, I think. I do think that any kind of guidance we can give parents, and this is partly selfishly because I'm also raising kids, I think any kind of guidance, if I can find authors and therapists and educators to help us figure out how to do this parenting stuff in a way that's peaceful and respectful and mindful of raising kids who are going to, leave the world better than they found it. I actually think that's some of the most important writing out there. Sometimes there's a little bit of criticism is too strong of a word, but sometimes there's a feeling, I think, among media critics that, women tend to write the stories about family and home life and features and lifestyle stuff. And then, the men sort of get the important beats, right, of like government and investigations and war coverage. And I feel like what happens at home and the environment that we create for our kids to grow up in and surround them with every day is just as important as any other beat out there. So for me, it's a real privilege to have this space and be able to call on like a Lisa D'Amour or call on, any sort of experts to say like, how in the heck do we do this? And how do we do it well? Because we need these kids to solve a lot of problems we've created, right? I mean, if you look at like the Greta Thunbergs and the Black Lives Matter and March for Our Lives activists, and it's the kids who are leading us on a lot of this stuff, and we need to know how to walk alongside them in some cases, guide them in others, get out of their way in others. So I really relish the opportunity to write about parenting as well.
Speaking of writing about parenting, I think I mentioned this to you. I was really struck by your column last week about the proposed naming change at a school in Chicago. And it occurred to me that was sort of a context in which you were talking about institutional change as well as individual learning about, what should be the messages and symbols around us. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about how you came to your belief that it's important to tie these issues of race as well as gender to, in your view, requisite shifts in institutions, sometimes led by kids, as you point out.
Yeah, well, a lot of our conversations around parenting and raising kids center on white families and white moms. And that's just an inaccurate telling of the way this country is operating, right? I mean, not every mom obviously is white and not every kid is white. And that tends to be who we hear from and who we see pictures of in commercials and on book covers. And Mickey Kendall writes about this way more intelligently than I ever could. And I'd encourage anybody to read Hood Feminism for the whole book, but that topic in particular is really poignant. But, of course, when you're, writing about something as broad and universal as parenting, because even if you're not a parent, you've been parented and you're sharing the world with parents. Certainly when you're writing about something that broad, race needs to be a part of it, in my mind, if you're going to be talking about how to do it well and equitable and with an eye toward the greater good. The story that you mentioned last week, the Agassi story, was fascinating. There's this group of parents who want, and they've been trying this for a few years now, to get the name Agassi removed from their elementary school in Lakeview because it's named for a scientist, Louis Agassiz, a scientist who believed that Black people and white people were two different species and that Black people were inferior to white people. And his sort of pseudoscience was used to justify slavery in his time and all sorts of white supremacist, policies that came out of slavery, right? And so this group of parents is saying, Black and brown children and any children really should not be subjected to walking through a building with that person's name on it and be learning science or any other subject under the name of a man whose writings were flawed and harmful. Speaking to the systematic part of your question, it was really interesting to talk to one of the moms who said that, so far what the principal has said to them is that, we will launch this formal CPS policy for, renaming a school or changing the name of a school. And on the one hand, that sounds like progress, but on the other hand, to this mom's point, she said that in itself is problematic. That policy is problematic. It shouldn't come down to, community meetings and a vote of a local school council to determine whether it's okay for kids to go to school, when the school's named for a racist scientist. It just should be a decision handed down by CPS. This person's writings are racist. That's a problem. We're not going to name our school after him anymore. Done. And so, I don't know what CPS will decide, but it's interesting to talk to someone who's so thoughtful and vocal and assured about, the entire system being a problem, right? This idea that we're sort of going to debate what's offensive and what's okay to leave up what's offensive. And it speaks to our broader national conversation right now about Jews and names of teams and all of it.
You also talk a lot about women and leadership. We've started talking some about that, but the importance to advance women in the workplace and government and civic leadership. Was there anything in your life that led to that, to want to be committed to advocating for women's leadership? Or, is this something you sort of came to organically?
I would say organically. I certainly grew up with an example of an involved, active in the community mom. My mom is a strong environmentalist who I watched, volunteering my whole life in the environmental movement and working to save land from being developed in the town where I grew up. And she still does that. And so I certainly had that in I don't know if I'd say background or foreground, but it was in my home. My whole life was watching my mom not only, I suppose, realize she had power and then wield it, but also for, the greater good, right? And not sort of like in a job at a bank or something, but actually to improve the world, the natural world anyway, around her. So I can't discount that, the influence of that. And then I think I just, there's something about journalism, at least the way I learned it in college and then in professional practice, that wants to see, the powerful held to account and power equally distributed and not abused. I mean, that's sort of one of the tenets of journalism, right? You're supposed to hold people accountable. And I think early on as a college student, even it felt to me like far too often, women, either as students or professors or any positions of power were being left out of those conversations. It felt to me early on like the prototype, sort of the example of power was male, and girls and women were sort of the extras in that film, sort of off to the side, could come in and fill in when necessary. But when we pictured authority, we pictured males, and that just always struck me as wrong. And I think it is what leads to pay discrimination. It is what leads to sexual harassment. It leads to this culture of like, the men are doing the real work and the women are here to cheer them along and come in and fill in when needed. But also when they're not needed anymore, they need to move back out of the way and let the men take back over. And that's, a little bit how we've framed work in this country for decades. And it's wrong. It's not fair. It doesn't build the best companies and businesses and, industries for starters, but it doesn't lead to the healthiest families and retirement accounts and parenting opportunities. And it's just not, and it also doesn't bring out the best in men. We all work best when we're working shoulder to shoulder and side by side. We need everybody's lenses trained on the future. We need everybody's thoughts and ideas and talents. And that's when we work best. And so it just has always struck me as narrow-minded and wrong to leave women out of those rooms where it happens, I guess.
If you hear cheering from far away, Heidi, no surprise. Yeah, one more reason, girlfriends who are listening, why I love what Heidi has to say, and Kelly does too. One of the things you just said was the example of power was male. You also said holding the powerful to account. And in that context, and in this context of women's leadership, women around the country, including of big cities like Chicago, than we've ever had before in our history. And remarkably, in Chicago's case, an African-American lesbian. For those of us who we worked for Harold Washington for mayor, it still is mind-boggling. But the important thing here, I think, is not only that this has happened and there's some progress, albeit slow, is what they do when they're in office. And I think going back to some of these other issues we were talking about related to race and change and where our country is today, I was wondering if you were to whisper in Mayor Lightfoot's ear, if you were to write a column saying, here's what I think you should do, what would be your opening?
I think in this moment, and this is going to sound like a little bit of a cop-out, but it's not, I think she should form a task force on race. And I think it should, to be honest, she might have something like this in the works already. I was surprised to see when the Columbus statue didn't come down, but the week before when the protests were happening around the Columbus statue, she said, we have a comprehensive policy we're working on and we just haven't released it yet. I was surprised that there was a comprehensive policy. So maybe there's something like this in the works, but something that would address everything from defunding the cops to cops in school to what to do with the Columbus statues if the removal truly is temporary, to honestly lead in the water, the overburdened deep tunnel system. All of those things are deeply rooted in the city's discriminatory past, segregated past, the gun violence. It's all related. And I think that if she had some sort of task force that, race would be sort of the umbrella term, but it would need to tackle all of those things through the lens of racial equity with, smart, diverse voices with lots of different backgrounds on it. I was super impressed with, I know she and Toni Preckwinkle are former rivals, but I was super impressed with Toni Preckwinkle's commentary the other day about the statue and in the Tribune. I just think the city is full of so many smart people with ideas. If she could get them in a room to, with the idea of solving some of our biggest, thorniest problems right now with an eye toward, racial justice, I feel like it could be like a national model and get at some of what has plagued Chicago for so long, which to me is all rooted in, segregation and
Right.
and discrimination. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big one.
Yeah,
and it's a task force, which people are like, task force, that does nothing. But it could.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Well, I think we've seen how interesting the conversations are at the Chicago Board of Education now, and they're a fairly diverse and very interesting group around these issues, around defunding or removing the police from CPS and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think, these could be really interesting conversations for a task force to tackle.
Mm-hmm.
And so our last question for you then is, a lot of people listening may be interested in being writers themselves and writing. This is such a tough industry
Yes.
right now. It has always been, but especially right now. Do you have advice for people who are interested in writing and becoming writers? How to go about it?
So sort of logistically, I would say, just start writing, work that muscle, whether it's journaling or blogging or submitting freelance pieces to Medium or whoever will take it. It is truly a muscle that you just have to exercise until it, works better, stronger. So I would just say, write as much as you can. Newspapers, I don't know. I don't know where they're going to be in a few years. So I never tell anybody to shy away from journalism, but I'm not sure journalism is going to be taking place in, sort of our legacy media companies the way we've been used to. I think that Chicago, though, I love the Tribune. I'm so proud to work there and work alongside my colleagues. I also think that, Chicago's bigger than the Tribune and the Sun-Times. The Tribe is fantastic. Block Club Chicago is fantastic. WBEZ is fantastic. So, it's a pretty exciting city to live and work in and want to write in. This is a tricky time to find the funding base for it, right? Because we're in a pandemic and people are trying to still figure out how to get the internet to fund its publications anyway, pre-pandemic. But I feel strongly that stuff will, be temporary, and there will always be an appetite and a need for these storytellers and witnesses to, our history. And so it feels very much like we're in a correction phase, I guess, or a figuring out phase of that. But I don't at all feel like eventually this stuff will just all fade out and disappear. I think, and when I say this stuff, I mean newspapers and media organizations. I just think that, we need somebody to figure out how to make the funding models work. But no, I would say, be a voracious reader of, books and media and then write your heart out and take a good hard look at all the places in Chicago that need writers, because there's a lot of them.
So speaking of writing your heart out, of course, it goes with speaking your heart out. And so, Heidi, thank you so much for being with us today. For those of you who don't live in Chicago, Heidi's column resonates, as you probably gathered from this conversation, across the country, in my view, in terms of what she talks about. She also has a podcast, and so we want to recommend that to you. After this interview is completed and dropped later today, you'll find links to Heidi's writing, the podcast, some other wonderful pieces. And thank you again for joining us. I hope you'll come back and share with us at another point. So take care, Heidi.
I would love to. Thanks for having me.
The Vote Her In segment is a collaboration of Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Our theme song is called Are You Listening, off of the album Elephant-Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at twobroadstalk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.